Hello, Vikings. Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I'm going to just review Unit 1, Topic 2, which is all about the different types of democracy. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I asked some students some prior knowledge questions, what they know about the different types of democracies, or what's pluralism, or who are the elite, and then who has the greatest influence in policy making. So our learning objective today is to explain how models of representative democracy are visible in major institutions, policies, events, or debates in the US, basically. So there's three basic types of representative democracy. I'm going to define all three. And you should know that we don't fit just one of these types, that our Constitution, the government that we've set up, that we see embodiments of all three of these types throughout the Constitution or throughout our society, basically. Participatory democracy just means that basically you're emphasizing broad participation in politics and civil society. So it's a model of democracy in which citizens have the ultimate powers. That's that idea of popular sovereignty, that they get to decide directly on policy and politicians who are responsible for implementing those policy decisions, basically. So this is kind of a self-defining term. It's basically just that it's a democracy in which you're having broad participation. So lots of voting, even where we're seeing, other examples of it when we see protests, when we see marches. That's all examples of participatory democracy. That's the people basically saying, we want to participate and we want to let our voice be heard and we want to make our policy actions be taken seriously, basically, and our recommendations be taken seriously. So pluralist democracy is basically, pluralism or pluralist just means many, basically. And so pluralism in AP government basically just means many groups. So it emphasizes group-based activism by non-governmental interests striving for impact on political decision-making. So when I think of pluralisms, I usually connect it to interest groups because those basically are the vehicles, are those interests that are striving for the impact on policymaking. So a lot of you guys research different interest groups. You're able to learn about how they influence policymaking, how do they organize protests, how do they lobby the government, how do they let policymakers know what needs to be done to make their society better, to address the interests that they think are most important. So it's a model of democracy in which no one group dominates politics. You got many organized groups that are competing with each other to try to influence policy. And James Madison talked about this in Federalist Number 10, where he basically said this is a good thing because essentially you're going to have no one group be able to dominate. You're going to have many groups competing with one another. They're going to be able to fight with each other, and you're going to get the best policy decisions or the best compromises that are going to come out of those fights, basically. And you won't have just one group dominating, essentially. So when I think of pluralism, I just think of interest groups, basically, because that's essentially what those non-governmental interests are, those interest groups that are trying to fight for policymaking, to try to shape public policy to their benefit, basically. Now, elite democracy. Elite democracy emphasizes limited participation in politics and civil society. And the elites basically represent like the ultra-wealthy or the very educated. So it's a model of democracy in which you don't want broad participation. You actually want a very small number of people, usually those who are wealthy and well-educated, that influence the political decision-making, essentially. And so there's parts of our country and our Constitution that do represent all three of these models, basically. This is a political cartoon kind of showing the argument that we're living in an elite democracy right now. So they're kind of showing that the corporate executives, the people, the ultra wealthy, are basically doing very well, but the wage earners, the workers at the bottom, that they're the ones who are suffering. Also, the idea that we're not all starting off at the same, on the same playing field, because if someone's very wealthy, then they're going to have more connections, better access to schools and education and opportunities for jobs. There was a movement called Occupy Wall Street, happened in around 2008 during the financial crisis. And basically, about 1% of the country controls 50% of the wealth. And the other 50% is controlled by 99% of the people. So this group was basically, they used that statistic. They even call themselves sometimes the 99%, essentially. And they felt like the 1% were making all the decisions and having all the influence in policy. So their protests were basically saying, you need to start listening to more of us, and we need to basically have our voices be heard. We don't want just the ultra wealthy making all our decisions. So I will have you do a practice thesis and a practice essay in the future that uses these three models. Develop an argument that explains which of the three models of representative democracy, participatory, pluralist, or elite, best achieves the founders' intent for American democracy in terms of ensuring a stable government run by the people. So the question is, what's the answer? Well, the way these thesis argument essays are written is that there's no one right answer. So the truth is that you could actually argue all three of these. I have another video that you can check out, how to write an argument essay, that actually goes through this question, talks about each of the three models, and explains basically, if I was going to argue participatory, this is how I would defend it with evidence, or if I was going to argue the other two, this is how I would defend it. So definitely I can argue all three. And a good thesis or argument essay, you should be able to just back it up with evidence, essentially. There's not going to be a one right answer. I asked the students for prior knowledge on Federalists and Anti-Federalists, or if we knew any of these people. And we kind of introduced the concept of the Federalist Papers. So what are the Federalist Papers? They're basically documents that were written defending the Constitution. Now, when they wrote the Constitution, by they I mean the founders, it didn't mean that it went into effect right away. The Constitution is our structure or framework of government. And so they wrote the Constitution, but then they had to take it back to the states to basically get their approval. So the states would go, okay, we like this and we want this to be our form of government, basically. But the Federalists knew that they didn't just want to, leave it up to the states and not have any arguments or feelings about this. So they wrote these essays, they wrote these papers essentially, and these papers basically just defended the document, explained why it was why it was going to work. Basically, there was 85 of them that went through all the pieces of the Constitution and why people shouldn't fear the Constitution, why it's actually going to be a better system of government than what they were living under at the time. And so they were written by three people, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They actually published them under pseudonyms, so under pen names, where they didn't actually reveal their identity. So only later on did we learn who wrote them and basically what were their arguments and understanding. Again, it gives us a good idea of understanding what the Constitution means, because these essays are a lot more detailed and explicit than the Constitution. So if you've ever seen the musical Hamilton, he actually addresses the Federalist Papers in the song Non-Stop, where he basically explains, we need to defend the U.S. Constitution, basically. So question that you want to know, how many Federalist Papers do you get to read? Do you need to read all 85? If you want to, feel free. I don't recommend it. They are very difficult to read. We will read some excerpts in this class, but we're not going to have you read the full documents. If you want to, I definitely, I recommend it if you're interested in trying to tackle some difficult texts and some complex texts, but it's not required. More so, we need to know the heart of these documents. So we're going to look at Federalist 10 and Fed 51 in Unit 1. And we'll explore Fed 70 and Fed 78 in Unit 2. So Federalist Paper number 10 was an essay written by James Madison, who's also called the father of the U.S. Constitution, because he wrote kind of the first draft of the Constitution. And Federalist 10 talks about how to guard against the mischiefs of factions, and it advocates for a large republic. So basically, the essay addresses the problem of factions, these groups of people that are trying to take rights away from the minority. And he basically says the way to protect best against that is having a large republic, a republic where people are represented, but over a large area, a large geographic area, basically. Brutus number 1 is an anti-Federalist paper. So this is a counter-argument to Madison and the Federalist Papers. Brutus, and again, this is not his real name, this is just the pen name that he published the paper under. But Brutus basically argued that we shouldn't adopt the new Constitution, that we shouldn't ratify it, we shouldn't approve it. So he's an anti-federalist who feels like he doesn't like the Constitution. He fears the federal government would eliminate the state and local authority and oppress the citizens. And he basically believed that small republics were the best to represent the people. So there's some tensions definitely between Federalist 10 and Brutus 1. Tension between, is it better to have just a broad participatory model that Brutus is arguing, or should we use a more filtered model like Federalist 10 argues, using the pluralist and the elite models, basically. So definitely some disagreements between which model is best among the framers and founders, for sure. So what are our key takeaways? What do we need to know about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists? We should know that the Federalists favored a stronger national government, that they also supported the new U.S. Constitution. They were mostly wealthy landowners. They were rich merchants. They mostly came from the North. The Anti-Federalists favored strong state governments. They liked a system where the state governments were actually more powerful than the national government. They did not want to ratify the new Constitution, so they were against it, and they tried to argue that it shouldn't be ratified or approved. And they really feared that a strong central government would basically render the states powerless. So those are the main key takeaways that you need to know about the two sides and their viewpoints. Basically, how do they feel about the size of the national government? Federalists wanted a strong, big national government. Anti-Federalists wanted a smaller national government with bigger state governments and stronger state governments. The Federalists loved the new Constitution. That's why they wrote those essays, to basically defend it and get people on board with it. And the Anti-Federalists tried to argue just the opposite. They were the ones who said, don't approve this new Constitution. It's dangerous, it's flawed, and there's all kinds of problems with it. And we'll explore some of those in our next lecture, where we'll take a deeper dive into Federalist 10 and Brutus 1, basically. So that's it for this lecture today on topic 1.2, the types of democracy. Please be sure to comment down below. Let me know if this helped you, or let me know if you have any questions. You can always send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions around the Anti-Federalists and Federalists and those documents as well. All right, Vikings, so that's it for topic 1.2. I appreciate you all for being here. I think you can subscribe over here, or like the video here, or watch new videos here. I always forget how YouTube does this. But I just appreciate you guys for checking in. And please make sure you're asking questions if you have them. I'm here to help, and I love to answer questions. So have a good day, Vikings.